the living space per person changes dramatically as people move to an urban environment. You'd think they would be willing to live in smaller spaces, but in fact the family sizes decrease, and with the aging population we're actually seeing an increase in the square footage, and that's helping to drive construction demand in the cities where it's very commodity intensive to build infrastructure. I mentioned before the strong growth in working age population in India, Middle East and Africa. And here we look at the growth in the urban population in those same areas and how that grows most strongly. So Africa's really stand out here in terms of the change in urban population and the need that will generate for infrastructure for construction activity. We've got a growing population using UN forecasts, so we will continue to drive construction through population. And as you can see at the bottom here, that urban growth has already overtaken rural in the early 2000s, and will move away quite dramatically through our forecast period. So very strong economics if you just draw out the urban population. So as I mentioned, city dwellers as a rule have slightly more money, they want slightly more space to live in, and they also consume more of other items that use commodities. They consume more transportation, they're more likely to use infrastructure projects, they consume more energy. In general, they're slightly better off moving into the middle class and consume more consumer goods. If we can find someone to invest in the infrastructure projects in an equivalent to the way the Chinese government has, and you've got to question whether some of the African states can afford that, but then we will have infrastructure growth for water, power, mass transit systems. Electric vehicle growth is also very interesting, pet topic of mine, but it's fastest in the cities due to the range of the vehicles and the availability of charging infrastructure. It really is an urban phenomenon at the moment until the range can increase. As people live, they don't just need houses, they need schools and hospitals. It's relatively stainless steel intensive, other commodity intensive to build out that kind of requirement. I mentioned the floor space and also the need, as people grow and have more money, they've got room for a refrigerator, room for an air conditioner, and it's a very positive effect. So we see demand growing across all those commodities I mentioned at the beginning, driven by the urbanization factor, particularly strong for buildings in the steel and the metal alloys and the copper, where you're putting in electric infrastructure into the buildings. People tend to want central heating, so more thermal coal, more electricity, and potentially different vehicle choices, which I'll come back to. So the focus on automotive, just briefly. It's a slightly complicated chart on the left, but it's very interesting to see how economies have been changing and moving towards vehicle ownership. The US stands out with more than one vehicle per capita, per active person of an age who can drive a car. But you can see the different economic development of countries. So Scandinavia, sort of levelling out at around 0.6 cars per active person, whereas Eastern Europe, people have obviously embraced the need to have their own car, and they're moving on different trajectories. But overall, we've been forecasting that automotive use will continue to grow, and you can see that as car costs have come down, the logarithmic fit of long-term trends shows that on average more and more cars are being consumed. What's interesting as we look slightly further is not only the effect that people who move to the city might want a car to begin with, but actually with the new data economies and the new difficulty of people maybe raising large amounts of finance, you can see the model of car ownership changing. And we think that with changes in technology that allow car sharing, so the Uber effect, car hire companies putting cars on the road, and then in the longer term, the rollout of self-driving cars, you can see the impact on commodities really changing over time. So in the short term, you might get electric cars. They may be owned by a central leasing company and you buy time. That car probably contains the same commodities, although there may be few of them on the road because you're using more of their time by sharing them, so the number of cars you need falls. But then in the longer term, you start to look at cars that need to be kept on the road for very high proportions of their time, and it becomes a question of maintenance and how you can keep that car looking good, looking clean, being available. And you're probably going to change the design of that car away from steel body plates, maybe to plastics and maybe to other materials. And with self-driving, the safety requirements of those vehicles changes really quite dramatically. And again, the commodities that you build that vehicle out of could really change in the very long time. So while urbanisation is strong for this, it might be that the commodities that are consumed within the automobile industry will change unrecognisably over the next 20 years. So we go through here a little bit of each of the commodities. In terms of urbanisation, I think maybe I'll leave you to read this in honour of time away from here. But the overall conclusions that we draw are that we have to actually look at megatrends now for the longer period. In CRU, we're looking at energy, we're looking at urbanisation, and we're looking at the use of data to manage manufacturing and material efficiency. Urbanisation is the most positive for commodity demand, and in some ways are relatively easier to foresee than maybe material efficiency changes. Policy around climate change is a really big unknown, and it could be that legislation prevents automobile ownership in cities. It could be that buildings have to be built to much higher standards, and that changes dramatically the materials that are required. We're very positive about energy storage, lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel for electric vehicles, but also in stationary storage. Lead still has quite a strong story associated with it. And vanadium, if people can make vanadium of an appropriate purity, there's no reason why the Radox stationary batteries shouldn't take off. But we do think that within the battery metals, there's quite a competition for technology. Now, this is a slide I present quite often at, or not. Another slide? There we go. This is the CRU heat chart, and I'll explain it briefly. So we take all the commodities we forecast at CRU and calculate the change in the commodity price from 2020 over last year. There's a few things to highlight. It's a base year, 2016, so depending on where you start, it shows the different percentage change. But it's quite clear that having shown lots and lots of these charts at this conference over the years, we have a much more rosy and much more positive outlook for the period ahead of us. And I think that maybe urbanisation is one of those topics that we need to come back to, maybe beyond 2020, to look at the commodities that will be driven. Oh, thank you for listening. That was it.
Thank you, Rebecca.